Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about cash flow forecasting and predictive analytics in liquid markets. So we're excited to be here talking to you. Briefly, in terms of introductions, my name is Alex Billias. I'm here with my colleague Sam, who will tell you a little bit about himself. But we work at a firm called Bella Private Markets, which is founded by Josh Lerner of Harvard Business School. So our work is primarily with fund managers, asset owners, and other market participants all over the world. A lot of that work comprises doing analytics along these lines, and we're excited to share some of that with you today.
Yes, thank you for the intro, Alex. I'm Sam Holt. I'm a principal here at Bella, and I joined Bella in 2017, the same year Alex did, and we're excited to present to you today. So let's get into it. So first off, here's just a quick agenda of the webinar. We'll start with a brief introduction into the difficulties that are associated with modeling illiquid asset cash flows, and then move into a discussion on some of the models that have tried to kind of deal with these difficulties and challenges. And after that, we'll follow into kind of like the Bella approach that we have taken with historical cash flow simulations, and then move into some sample use cases of how our model can be applied. And at the end, I think we're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions that the audience might have. So let's get into it. So first off, I mean, as you can see, the private equity industry has become more or less a financial juggernaut over the past few decades. Like if you look at the graph here, you can, over the past few decades, you can see that the growth in AUM has been exceptional. When you look at 2000, you had AUM at around maybe $600 billion, just slightly over that. But then when you move to 2022, you can see that the AUM in the industry is approaching $10 trillion at over $9 trillion. So it is quite the market. And so with that, though, there are a few defining characteristics that really set private equity and private markets apart from others. Mainly, it is an inefficient market, and that comes from the fact that it's illiquid. It's very long-term in nature, and both of these things kind of coalesce together to create a large amount and significant amount of information asymmetry within the market. And all of those defining characteristics of the private markets really make it challenging to kind of model and forecast private equity fund cash flows that investors and fund managers might expect. So they're moving off from that, though. There are two larger issues that come from these defining characteristics that really make cash flow forecasting difficult, and that's the J curve and the dispersion of returns that we've observed in private markets. And so we'll discuss both of those in a little bit more detail. So first off, we'll discuss the J curve problem. And as you can see, the J curve describes the tendency of private market cash flows to start off negative in return, and cash flows to be negative, returns to be negative in the initial years of a private equity fund. So you have that investment period that in the beginning of a fund of about 3 to 5 years, where the manager is really taking the capital that it has raised and calling it and investing in the companies that he or she believes they can create value in. And eventually, as they've invested the capital, as they've applied their value creation strategies, you start to see positive cash flows and positive returns later in the fund's life. We'll hopefully see those positive cash flows and positive returns later in the fund's life. And so this really reflects kind of the illiquidity in the market and how hard it is to really estimate different cash flows and estimate when you might expect a capital call from your GP, or when you might expect some kind of capital distribution back to you from the fund. So a way to think about it is capital calls are kind of like a type 4 liability, right? You don't know when they will occur, and you don't know how large they will be. And the same thing goes for distribution. You don't know how large it will be, and you're not really certain when will it occur. So these aspects all kind of form the J curve, and is the first initial problem associated with private markets that make cash flow forecasting very difficult. And then, as you can see, when you move from one fund to a portfolio of, let's say, 8 funds, that problem is just exacerbated even more. It's multiplicative, and it's really hard to figure out when you might expect a capital call from fund 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And this gets even more difficult when you have funds of a different strategy and of a different asset class. So that's just, when you're dealing with portfolios, that problem becomes even larger. And then the second big issue that I mentioned is this idea of the dispersion of returns that we've observed in the asset class. So as you can see in this chart here, when you're looking at global VC and global PE, that range between the average or median investor to, let's say, one of like the top 5% investor is rather large. Like, for instance, with global venture capital, as you can see, the cutoff to be a top 5% manager here is a return of a since inception return of around 47%. And the median cutoff is right around 13%. And then it's a little bit it's a little bit closer for PE, with the top 5 manager cutoff at around 32% and the median manager at 11%. But when you move farther to the left on this chart and you look at kind of some of the public equity investors, you'll see that dispersion in returns between managers is actually a lot more compressed. So for example, if you look at kind of in the middle there, you have a US large cap value investor or manager. That cutoff to be a top 5% manager in that asset class is right around 12%. But if you move to the median cutoff is right at 9.5, 10%. So that dispersion of returns is a lot more compressed, and the returns from manager to manager are going to be a lot more similar in that asset class compared to the private asset classes of PE or buyout and VC, where the returns from one manager to the next can be highly dispersed. So when you take that into consideration, that really makes cash flow forecasting difficult, because the expected range of cash flows and sizes and timing can be very different from manager to manager. So if you take that and then compound it with the finding that performance persistence is starting to wane in private markets, it just compounds that issue even more. And what we mean by performance persistence here is, when you have a general manager who has one fund and was a top quartile fund manager, it isn't guaranteed that they will replicate that top quartile performance. And specifically, if you look at VC managers in the period post 2000, only 30% of VC managers have actually replicated that top quartile performance. And that even lessens when you look at buyout managers, where only around 24% have been able to replicate that top quartile performance. So if you take these two issues of kind of that J curve and illiquidity aspect of the private markets, and then combine it with the fact that the dispersion of returns are so large, it really makes it difficult to build a model that really nails down the cash flow forecasting to develop expectations of when you might expect a capital call or how large it might be. And I mean, beyond just kind of these basic characteristics of the private markets, there are some practical and analytical issues to consider as well. So first off, when you're building a model, the model has to have assumptions and inputs that are defensible. And then when you try and do that in private markets, it's very difficult, and it's hard to really, I guess, develop those assumptions with rigor. And beyond that, you have to think of, is my model generalizable? Can I use it multiple times? Or if I have a change to my portfolio, or if I'm considering a new portfolio, do I have to build that model back up from scratch in the beginning? So these are definitely some analytical issues you have to consider when doing private equity forecasting as well, cash flow forecasting as well. And we've all been subject to the doing these types of analytical projects and in Excel and being hit with the dreaded ref. So that's another issue that you have to deal with when modeling these kind of cash flows. So with those issues behind us, you would think there have been individuals out there attempting to really develop a model that addresses these issues and accurately, defensively, and simplistically can model and forecast private equity cash flows. So we're next going to take a look at a few of those attempts and provide a brief overview. So early on in the private equity industry, before the 2000s and even into the 2000s, you had this idea that a lot of it was based off of intuition. And here you have a quote from David Rubenstein, who has been an incredibly successful private equity investor, as I'm sure you know, at the Carlyle Group, where he says, when you can make a decision with analysis, you should, but it turns out that you're often making decisions in your life that are based on instinct, intuition, taste, and heart. And honestly, that's how the private equity industry was first handled. And that, like, there wasn't really a huge analytical push to develop cash flow forecasting in the earlier days of the industry. But as the industry progressed and there were more entrants and I guess competition was starting to rise, there were individuals that really looked to build up that analytical rigor to apply to their investment decisions and their methodologies. And some of the original ones to do this were Dean Takahashi and Seth Alexander from the Yale University Endowment. They really wanted to kind of move the idea of private equity analytics and cash flow modeling from the art aspects of it and really focus on the science aspect of the exercise. And it really helped that they were at Yale. And I'm sure you know that Yale is one of the preeminent private equity and VC investors, and they've really focused on investing in venture capital and private equity managers for decades at this point. So what that created was a really rich data set that both Dean and Seth could leverage to really try and build out a defensible model to accurately forecast different cash flow types and values of their portfolios into the future. And then when they set out to do this, they really set out to base it on 4 general criteria. And they're very common sense criteria. Number 1, the model should be simple and sensible. It should be able to, and then number 2, it should be able to incorporate and respond to actual data as it becomes available. So it should be generalizable and you should be able to update it with ease. And after that, you should be able to analyze the impact of different scenarios on your portfolio. So more or less building in this like ability to run scenario analyses on your outcomes. And then at the very end, you should be able to run this model on different asset types. It should be able to run on buyout. It should be able to run on venture capital, or if you have real estate or infrastructure, the model should be able to incorporate those different types of asset types and their cash flows. So building off of those 4 criteria, they developed what is very much a simple model when you consider the complexity of the cash flows that they are actually trying to forecast. So the model used 6 basic inputs in the end to help project their private equity fund portfolio expected contributions, distributions, and how the asset value of that portfolio would develop over time. And those 6 inputs are the rate of capital contributions, or said differently, how quickly the capital will be called by their portfolio or their private equity fund managers that they're invested in. And then the second one is the initial capital that they have committed to the funds. The third input is the assumed life of the funds in their portfolios, which is often between 10 to 12 years on average in the private equity world. And then you have this other factor, which they would call the Bow factor. And this was a parameter that they developed that helps basically estimate and describe the change in the rate that the distributions were made back to them over time. So you can assume that earlier on in a fund's life, the rate of distributions, or this Bow factor, is going to be lower, but as it gets later in the life, when the value is created and realized, that might actually increase and you'll see a higher rate of distributions. And then you have G, which is the assumed growth rate in the fund over the fund net asset values over time. And this last one, which is not a required input, is the yield. And you can kind of think of yield as it applies to a fixed income instrument. It's more or less a minimum periodic distribution that one can expect. And when you're dealing with buyout and venture capital funds, that's yield isn't a common characteristic of these cash flows. So it's often set to zero, and that's why it's not a required input. So you can imagine if you had a portfolio of private debt funds, that actually might be an input that's incorporated into the 4 equations that we'll discuss now. So they took these inputs and developed these 4 basic equations to help forecast the capital contributions, the distributions, and the change in NAV over time. And as you can see in equation 1, the contribution is just a function of the rate at which capital is being called and a function of the remaining capital to be called, or the unfunded commitment that the fund has. And then distributions are simply, here in equation 2, a function of the rate of how those distributions are going to occur, and also a function of the actual value of the assets held by the fund. And third, you have the rate of distributions, in which I referred to earlier, incorporates that Bow factor. And it is just a function of how old the fund is, and then also a function of that Bow factor and the change in the rate at which the distributions will occur. And then finally, you have the NAV equation, which is just a function of the prior period's NAV and the growth rate, plus any capital called and minus any distributions given back to the investor. And as you can see, all of these equations are highly dependent on each other and also dependent on the prior period. So one issue you can already start to see here is if your estimate has error earlier on, that error can then be compounded because each equation is dependent on the other and on the prior period. So we'll dig into some of the issues with the model, but that's just one that I wanted to point out here. But that being said, we now dive into how well the model actually worked. And as you can see here, it actually worked really well. And that's, I think, a testament to the fact that it was developed over 20 years ago, and it is still the preeminent model that most market participants use. So here you can see we have graphs here that outline net asset value, contributions, and distributions for the fund over time. And you can see that black line, which represents the output from the TA model, is very much in line with those red bars, which are the actual observed net asset values, contributions, and distributions. I mean, you can see at times there is some over and under projection, but all in all, the results are very good, as you can see. So that brings us to the question: if it isn't broken, why do we need to fix it? And here we bring up some issues that kind of led us to explore different ways that private equity cash flows can be modeled, and how it can be improved and how it can be made to be more efficient. So as I said, it clearly has many benefits. It's an intuitive model, pretty easy to apply, and as you saw, generally effective. However, when you're actually putting it into practice, there are a few limitations. The first one, and any model is subject to this one, to be fair. So you have this garbage in, garbage out issue. So you're heavily dependent on the data you have, and you're also heavily dependent on the input assumptions that you put together, which often input assumptions can be highly subjective, and they can highly influence the results that you see with your model. And as you can tell, if we go back to the inputs of the model, you can see some of these involve some subjective decisions to make, like the rate that the capital will be contributed, the rate at which it will be distributed, are highly subjective, can be highly subjective assumptions and inputs. And that moves us to the second issue here: is input derivation can be very quantitatively hard to do, computationally hard, even more so than applying the model itself. So how are you going to determine and actually quantitatively figure out what the rate of distribution in your model is going to be? And the same can be said with the rate of contributions. And thirdly, here we have the fact that the output of the TA model is very limited. You get one set of point estimates for periodic capital calls, for periodic distributions, and for periodic net asset values. And this leads into the final issue and relates back to the issue that we discussed concerning the dispersion of returns in the private equity space. One point estimate doesn't account for this incredibly wide dispersion of possible outcomes that we have observed in the private equity space. And so when you are heavily reliant on just one point estimate, it can kind of create this false sense of confidence in the results of the model. So that's something you have to be very careful with when you're dealing with a model that just kind of gives you that one final data point at the end. And to address these issues, there have been some other approaches tried in the industry. But as I mentioned, the TA model it remains the gold standard to this day. So you had some individuals that tried to create bottom-up models, but these are difficult to apply, and that's largely a function of the fact that data availability and the data in the private equity space is opaque. It's hard to get that portfolio company level information that you would need to really build up a bottom-up model. And building on that, the data that you do get is often inconsistent from data provider to data provider, or even investor to investor. And that can be inaccurate. And also, there's a delay in which that data is available. So it can really make the bottom-up models hard to use when trying to forecast. And then the second attempt was to try a little bit more statistical rigor and to create regression models, which can be applied, and there can be some use for this. However, with private equity, the determinants of the size and timing of cash flows and the determinants of performance over underperformance is really hard to identify, and it's really hard to decompose. As we showed, like that dispersion of returns is high. The inability of fund managers to really replicate that performance is high. So that makes it hard to apply these regression models to get results that you can really trust. And in the end, there's also the issue with data. You have to have a large amount of data to really quantify all of these factors that you've decided have an impact on performance. And you have to have a lot of data to get outcomes that you can trust and meet that statistical rigor. And then finally, we have individuals out there that have tried machine learning and other more complex statistical methods. These, while they might have some use, they're hard to apply because mainly, and this is the case with most machine learning that we come across, it's black boxes, and it's really hard to translate what is going on to a stakeholder that you are trying to convince your results of. And then honestly, it's still subject to the issues around the subjectivity around the assumptions and input used in the machine learning and statistical models. So after that had us thinking, after we've tried to implement TA and address kind of this cash flow forecasting models in different ways. And over time, we started thinking of what would be best? What are the criteria that we think are needed to really make a viable model in this space? So that got us thinking. And what we did is we started with the TA model's 4 basic criteria, and we took those, but we also wanted to address some of the shortcomings that we just discussed. And based off of that, what we kind of came up with is that we wanted to create a model that was based on 4 criteria as well, that are very simple and reachable. So 1, the model needs to be intuitive, easy to use, and easy to explain. 2nd, we want to get rid of that subjective assumption aspect of the model. We don't want to have inputs that we had to make like a subjective decision to include or not include, or what to include in the model. And then also we wanted to be able to build one that could bring in and take advantage of as much data that is available. And luckily, over the past few years, especially recently, the private equity data available for building out a forecasting model is becoming more prevalent. And that's helping us and others out there develop models that are really starting to hone in on being able to forecast these cash flows with accuracy. And then lastly, and I think most importantly here, is we wanted to build a model that provide a probabilistic range of estimates to better reflect the nature of private equity outcomes. As I've said 1,000 times, the returns are highly dispersed. So we wanted to build a model that kind of gave you a range, that gave you, all right, with 80% confidence, we can think that you might have this many distributions in this period and so on. So we wanted to get away from that one single point estimate and give the user and give ourselves a range of outcomes that we can consider. So how can you construct such a model? And that's what we've been working on here at Bella. And at this point, I will hand it over to my colleague, Alex, and he will discuss what we've been up to.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, like Sam mentioned, lots of fundamental difficulties with those more traditional models. So what we did is we looked to other areas for inspiration. We thought about this, and ultimately what we came up with was this idea of looking at simulations. So in particular, here we're talking about historical simulations. So this is something we wrote a paper about recently, Journal of Portfolio Management, where we're using concepts from other fields. So, Monte Carlo simulations, for instance, have always been used in public markets, largely a function of the data availability, the number of securities, the long time series we have data to be able to run those sorts of analyses. That was not so much the case until really recently for private markets. In private markets, we've adapted that idea and we've used historical fund level cash flow data. So what we're doing is we're sampling from the history of private market funds in order to construct thousands of portfolios that mirror your own, and then looking at how those trajectories evolve. So in this way, it's very similar to, for instance, if you look at a hurricane map and how those types of forecasts work, for instance. So you can sort of see, sort of in the initial periods, the forecast, the range is a little bit smaller. You have more certainty of how things may evolve. As you go further out, you start to see how those range of trajectories could really evolve. So, for instance, this really captures that idea of dispersion in private markets. Can you flip to the next slide, Tim? So in this way, we really address the shortcomings that we saw with other models. So like Sam mentioned, ideally you want something intuitive, easy to use. One of the really nice things about this type of approach is you really only require the existing portfolio information. Because we're using historical funds and mapping them to your current portfolio, it doesn't require subjective input assumptions. In this way, it really just requires the existing information to be able to manipulate the historical funds. In addition, right, so no assumptions about growth rates, no assumptions about how things may evolve. Really, you're taking advantage of all that historical data. So to the extent that cash flow data is updated, more funds begin reporting to these different databases, or even as an individual investor may add more funds to their portfolios, all of that additional data can be incorporated. So another actually criteria that the TA developers were interested in as well. And then finally, like we saw, it really captures this probabilistic range of outcomes by plotting out all of these thousands of different trajectories. Beauty of it is you can assign these probabilities to what may or may not happen based on what actual historical outcomes revealed could be the case and what we've actually observed. So going down a level deeper, how does it really work? So like I mentioned, we're sampling historical funds, but really the best way to think about this type of model is if you think of your portfolio as consisting of, let's say, private equity funds. And private equity funds are typically defined by their vintage year, the year in which they were formed or started fundraising, or rather investing. And so if you have a portfolio of multiple funds relative to, say, today, in this example, we say if you have a portfolio as of 2023 with funds of vintage years 22, 2020, 19, and 18, what we're really doing is taking those funds and shifting them backwards in time, pretending as if instead of it being 2023, it were maybe 2013. And so what we're able to do is sample funds from the relevant vintages relative to that historical starting year in order to create a portfolio that mirrors in age and the age range of funds your current portfolio as of today. And by doing this across lots of different historical starting years, 2013, 2012, 2015, all the way back as far as data permit, you're able to create that sort of range of outcomes that we saw a little bit of in the prior slides. Now, in terms of the inputs to this type of model, like I mentioned briefly, no explicit assumptions. You really only need the existing portfolio information. And so here we just have a snapshot of kind of what we used when implementing this model. You can see the really information you only need is demographic information for your funds, vintage years, strategy, maybe it's geographic focus, but then other basic information like the total commitment, the amount of unfunded capital, so the amount that you're still on the hook for to be called in the future by the fund manager, the existing net asset value of the fund, to the extent there is one, as well as the amount of distributions paid back to you and the capital already paid into the fund. So with those very basic pieces of information, what we're able to do is take that portfolio, map it to the historical funds, and adjust and rescale the cash flows such that they mimic your actual portfolio. So process-wise, this first step is this idea of calculating what we call launch years, so the historical years into which you're shifting the portfolio. On a practical basis, this is done algorithmically. You can imagine it's really going to depend on any given portfolio you're trying to model. So in an ideal world, you'd have enough funds to be able to model any portfolio over any number of historical time periods. The reality is private equity data in particular, it's really only started within the last few decades. So there's really a cap on the back end of how far back in time you can go. More than that, too, earlier years tend to have less funds who've reported data, so there are data quality issues as well as sort of just an amount of data available. So as you have portfolios that maybe are larger in size or span larger ranges of vintage years, you can imagine that there may be less historical periods with enough data to model that portfolio. On the other hand, to the extent you maybe have a smaller portfolio with fewer funds or a smaller age range, you can sort of see, even just visualizing this sort of shifting idea, there'll be more data available to the funds. And so this is something that's calculated automatically up front. We've used sort of algorithms to do this based on the portfolio that you're uploading and you want to model, as well as the underlying data available. And so it'll figure out sort of what periods are available and how to model that particular portfolio. And so another great part of this is this idea of launch years allowing you to really zone in on different historical time periods. So not only does it allow you to capture a whole range of historical outcomes, but by honing in, you can sort of craft these historical scenarios. So for instance, if you're interested in looking at what might happen if the next few years looked like 07, 08, 09 following the GFC, for instance, what would the impact be if I honed in on that historical time period only for the purposes of my model? The nice part about it is the results you will see are based on actual historical outcomes for funds that went through that period of time, as opposed to sort of just having to put your finger on the scale, make these sort of ad hoc adjustments of saying, well, what if exit markets dry up? My distributions are just decreased across the board by 15, 20%, same with my net asset values. It's a way to sort of avoid having to make those sorts of subjective assumptions and adjustments that can a lot of times cause problems with your actual output. So after figuring out which historical time periods are available to the model, what it'll do is essentially loop through these different years. And so what we're doing, specifically is for a given historical launch year, we're randomly sampling funds of the requisite vintages relative to that launch year. We're doing it without replacements. We're always generating unique portfolios. And because we've calculated up front what periods we know are going to work, we're not going to run into a case which otherwise would happen often where the historical period may not work. You may not have enough data. So we've worked out how to really avoid that issue. So after sort of sampling the funds themselves, like I mentioned a few times, we make it look like the actual portfolio. So what does that really mean? So after we've sampled the historical funds relative to our starting year, those funds may have been much larger or smaller in size than the ones that we're interested in. We know that they came from a different time period. And we also know that likely they're going to have different sort of starting values, right? So you may have a fund in your portfolio that has a starting, say, for instance, paid in to committed capital ratio of maybe 0.5. So half of the capital has been called as of the time you're running this analysis. If you sample historical funds relative to a certain time period to represent this fund in your portfolio, there's no guarantee that it will also have called exactly 50% of its commitment. So what we need to do is adjust the historically sampled funds such that they're starting at the same point in time. And we do this on the basis of the amount of capital called, the starting RVPI ratio, which is sort of the ratio of a fund's starting net asset value or net asset value to the total amount of contributions paid in, sort of a multiple of the unrealized value of the portfolio. And likewise, we do a similar exercise for distributions using the DPI ratio, so the distributions to paid in, which is essentially a measure of the realized investments as a multiple of what you've paid in. So by looking at these starting values for the actual funds in your portfolio, as well as the historical, we're able to line things up such that everything's starting at the same point. And you can see that after that initial adjustment is made, we then sort of ride out what happens with the rest of the cash flows from the historical funds. So by setting the starting conditions, we can then just follow the trajectories that the historical funds actually achieved in order to come up with one possible outcome for what may happen to your actual portfolio. And so by doing this thousands of times across different time periods and sampling different funds, you can generate these pretty wide ranges of output. You can have thousands of portfolios, thousands of quarters of simulated data that you can really dig into. So the easiest way to look at this is just, for instance, you could look at percentile outcomes. 50% of portfolios achieved at least this much by this date. Or if you're thinking in terms of maybe an asset liability matching framework, you could say that X number of portfolios managed to distribute this amount of capital calls, or rather this amount of capital, which I know is needed to cover my liabilities over some horizon. You can also, because it's such a wide range of output, feed this into other subsequent analyses that you may want to run. For instance, if you have waterfall structures, for instance, sometimes where it allocates where different parts of the distributions are going and under what conditions. Another case might be risk models, where you can run sort of this through in a similar process. You can even imagine using it for something like hedging calculations. So if you have foreign currency exposure, for instance, in your portfolio's funds, if you don't know when capital might be called or to be distributed, it's hard to hedge that exchange rate risk. And so by sort of sticking these probabilities on outcomes, you're able to better determine hedges and sort of hedge your portfolios appropriately with this sort of input. This also allows for making other adjustments. Because you have such a wide range of output, of course, you're going to see the range of what actually happens, but you may have inside information where for instance, that because of some upcoming exit that one fund manager expects, that the fund value is going to hit a 2.5x or something like this. So that's a piece of information you can also easily incorporate. So once you have that forecasted range of outcomes, it's then easy enough to shift them one way or the other to meet expectations based on your own private information. You can make similar adjustments when creating other sort of hypothetical scenarios as well. So we talked about the idea of being able to hone in on time periods to craft historical scenarios. To the extent you really want to make it extreme and say, all right, let's look at a GFC era and let's layer on top of that a reduction in distributions. These are all models that really are easy to run once you have that underlying sort of set of output. It doesn't require rerunning things, rebuilding things. All of this is really nice to be able to do after the fact without having to create a new model from scratch. So this is one of those things where it's like, oh, if you say it fast, sounds good, right? Questions really, does it actually work? So we investigated this, of course. We did a lot of systematic backtesting. So the way in which we did this to sort of see the validity, the robustness, the accuracy of this model is we took historical cash flow fund data, right? The fund level cash flow data we're using for our simulations. And what we did is think of one run. We would randomly sample a handful of funds, stick those together and pretend that that's a portfolio. We'll set that portfolio and its cash flows to the side. What we'll then do is model that one portfolio we set to the side using the remaining funds in the data set. And we did this using both our simulation model as well as the TA model, sort of as a benchmark. So what we did is, for the simulations, like I said, use the remaining funds that we didn't set aside. For the TA model, we use the information that would have been available to someone modeling the portfolio as of that point in time. So for instance, if your target portfolio you're modeling maybe consisted of funds, maybe ranging in age from say 3 to 5 years old as of 2010, we would use inputs to the TA model that would have been available to someone in 2010 who would have been interested in running that sort of comparison. And so with those forecasts from each of the two models, we then compare them to the known cash flows of that portfolio we set aside. And that allows us to say, all right, which one got closer to the truth at the end of the day? And so we repeat this for thousands of different target portfolios, running thousands of simulations and versions of the TA forecast to create a whole spectrum of backtest output. So if we look at just one of these target portfolios to sort of visualize what we're doing, make it a little more intuitive, this is what, for instance, a TA forecast compared to the actual cash flows of a portfolio looks like. So for this particular portfolio, if we look at, for instance, the contributions, the purple line here is what the TA model said should have been distributed, or rather called, in each period going forward. Whereas the gold line we see is the actual contributions. We see it actually called a little bit more than the model predicted. If we look at then distributions in the middle, we can see that the TA actually overprojected distributions here. So the reason you see 3 lines is, if you recall that bow factor Sam was talking about, to adjust the shape of the distributions, the amount distributed in each period. We used a range of those estimates based on those suggested by the original authors. And so to get somewhat of a range of possibilities for what TA could do to make sure we're not really kind of honing in on one particularly good or bad estimate, we use this range. And so you can see likewise for NAVs, on the right, you have that range of 3 forecast lines that actually vary very widely. But we see that the actual net asset value is actually in the lower end of the projected outcomes. So you can imagine taking these 3 charts, but multiplying them by, say, 1,000, or how many backtest portfolios we actually run for the purposes of this analysis. And then we would compare on a quarterly basis how close each one got. If we look at that same portfolio that we set aside and it's plotted its cash flows over the simulated lines, we can make a few observations. So one, this is what the simulation output looks like for a given portfolio. We see this sort of range of simulated outcomes about some central estimate. And this is based on, again, what the historical funds actually did, subject to rescaling to look like your actual portfolio. We can see in all cash flow types in all of these cases that the actual gold lines, like what was achieved in terms of contributions, distributions, and asset value, fell pretty comfortably within the range of simulated output. So you can see in the center range, that's sort of, about the median, the 50th percentile simulated outcome, and then they fan out from the 10th up to the 90th. And so we can see in all cases, it's captured pretty closely within the center of that range. So if we analyze these tests over the hundreds of thousands of back test portfolios that we created, we have a few observations. So if you look at contributions, the charts on the left, on the top, we have the median percentage error, along with the 75th and 25th percentile error, right? So now we're looking at percentage error terms. And we're seeing that for TA, the average percentage error forecast is right around 0% across the life of a simulation or a forecast, right? So if we go out 20 quarters, so a 5-year forecast window, in each quarter, we're looking at the distribution of percentage errors that we saw across the different tests and models. So if we look at the same metric for the simulations, again, we see pretty much 0% error across the board for contribution. So this suggests both models aren't particularly biased one way or the other when it comes to forecasting the contributions, which is good news. You look at distributions and then asset values, however, the story starts to change a little bit. So if we look at the top chart with the TA forecast, the percentage error in quarterly distributions, you can see a few observations. So one, there's a wider range of percentage errors that we're observing. So anywhere from the 25th to 75th percentile, looks like it ranges from maybe around a 30 to 40% over projection up to a maybe 10% under projection. So in these charts, positive percentage error on the top is under projection while negative is over. And we can see here that there might be a little bit of a bias in TA, right? So it's not necessarily centered about zero anymore. In fact, that range of outcomes no longer overlaps zero, particularly in the later periods of the forecast. Compare that to the simulation output, however, we see that one, the median percentage error is closer to zero throughout the forecast, but two, that range is always clustered and comprises 0% error, which is good. We see a slight over projection bias, which makes sense. Distributions themselves are not bounded in some way, like contributions are bounded by some total commitment, or like net asset value is bounded ultimately by zero. So it makes sense to see a little bit of a over projection bias here. And then if we look at NAV, it's sort of a similar story where the range in errors for TA in particular is quite wide, whereas it's narrower for simulations. And here it's actually nicely centered about 0%. So it seems like simulations serve a lot of functions. It really overcomes a lot of the challenges we saw at TA. So, we overcame the GIGO issue. No real assumptions are required here. Don't have to worry about deriving any sorts of inputs. It just takes your actual portfolio values, rescales them appropriately. And we're immediately capturing both these issues of dispersion of returns and giving a wide range of output. So in that way, we're really ticking all the boxes with the simulation type of approach. So very briefly, we'll just highlight a few possible use cases for something like simulations, right? So illustrative examples, most straightforward is probably just developing these sorts of cash flow pacing performance expectations. So you can look at, percentile simulation range, you can dig into the distribution of actual outcomes within any given quarter as well. Because there are so many simulated outcomes, it allows for looking into those distributions of outcomes and analyzing them statistically as inputs to other models and so forth. Likewise, when it comes to portfolio design, this is an important way of getting at that question. So if you had, say, 3 different portfolios you're choosing among, and they had different characteristics in terms of vintage year, strategy mix, commitment sizes, what have you, it's hard to know up front what works, what may not work, what may be the best, what may be the worst. Simulations allow you to quickly explore those different outcomes by looking at sort of these ranges of possibilities. So here we have ranges of TVPI estimates, so essentially the realized plus unrealized value divided by the total amount of capital paid in for each. It allows you very quickly to get a sense of the range of expectations for a given portfolio. Likewise, we mentioned the scenario analysis. Here's just a visualization of what it looked like. So if you ran sort of a base case simulation, 10 fund portfolio over 5-year horizon, here's sort of the range of outcomes you may expect in terms of net cash flows. So distributions less capital calls. You can imagine running that same one, but focusing on that GFC era. And here we can see the impact of that scenario on the outcomes. So now we see a lower net cash flows, meaning the distributions weren't as great during those time periods. We also see the range is somewhat compressed, which suggests that a lot of funds suffered across the board, as opposed to seeing the somewhat wider range of dispersion in the base case. Likewise, too, I mentioned the ability to sort of incorporate this private information to really calibrate those scenarios and sort of make sure the portfolio or individual funds reach some target level. The last one that I think is worth mentioning is sort of these more creative structured finance type applications. So in particular, securitization and collateralizing funds is something we're starting to see more of in private equity. We've actually used this model for a large series of collateralized fund obligations that were backed by portfolios of PE funds. And so we used in the purposes of risk assessment, looking at the range of possible outcomes. We ran the simulated output through a waterfall that allowed us to say, here's the risk to the A note holders, the B notes, sort of this multi-tranche product. And by using the simulated output, we were able to put probabilities on sort of extension risk for the different bondholders. So just to wrap up quickly, I mean, simulations really are sort of a next step, it seems like, in this process of forecasting. You know, we've seen so much development in terms of applications of AI and more complex modeling in private markets that these funds are investing in, but far fewer examples of funds and institutional investors sort of bringing these types of ideas in-house and really developing and innovating themselves. And so this is sort of a step in that direction. So these simulations using historical data overcome a lot of the existing modeling challenges, really lend themselves to a whole variety of use cases, and in many ways sort of bring us into a next era of modeling that really takes advantage of these new data sources, data availability, and data techniques. So thanks, everyone. It looks like we had maybe a question or two in the chat. So I think here we have a question just briefly about backtesting, where the question is essentially, is the model providing evidence for its efficacy using itself, assuming I'm understanding the question correctly. So to reiterate maybe briefly in the backtesting, in a sense, if you think about what we're doing, it's not so much that we're looking at the ability of the model to sort of replicate artificial outcomes, right? We're not really evaluating it against some sort of statistical output, right? We're really saying, let's compare it to actual known data. And if you think about, again, what we're doing is it's a matter of rescaling and then comparing known to forecasted. So we've done this actually in different data sources as well. We've done it across data sources. In this way, the model is essentially data agnostic. It's really just a game of picking, choosing, and rescaling. And so in that sense, because we see sort of that still there's a limited bias one way or the other, regardless of the data source portfolio used, we have pretty strong confidence in the ability of the model to provide generally unbiased results. I have another question about impact of subscription lines of credit. It's a great question. And this is one we thought about before, where what's the impact of subscription lines of credit, essentially credit facilities that funds use as opposed to calling capital directly from LPs? This is a good question. And as the person who posed it pointed out, it's not necessarily reflected as much in the historical data. And so this is a limitation of any sort of historical-based analysis, in that it's not always going to capture the most up-to-date contemporary information. That said, if you think about this model from an LP's perspective, for instance, the rate at which, or rather GP's perspective, the rate at which capital is called and when it's called, whether it's to an LP or to a credit facility, it's not necessarily going to be viewed on the part of the person doing the model. So from their perspective, you're still on the hook for the call at some point, whether a GP used a credit facility or called it directly from the LPs. So, you know, there's some reason to think that from an LP perspective, someone using this model, the impact may not be as maybe stark as you might expect. Again, this is something, though, that really we can only answer definitively as more data become available and as time moves on. Sam, anything else to add?
No, I think you hit that one on the head. Yes.
Well, if it seems like no other questions at this point, I guess we can, at this point, stop talking. But I definitely want to say thank you to CFA Society Boston for hosting us, letting us chat about some of the work we're doing here, as well as CFA Institute overall for all the great work they do in promoting furthering education and all the interesting research and analysis they put out. So thanks, everyone, for participating, tuning in. We appreciate your time, and best wishes for the rest of your weeks.
Yes, thank you very much.